The pious, the penitent, and the faithful. Every year in Ireland, thousands drag their weary limbs up Croagh Patrick. Medieval Europe was full of such pilgrimages, attracted by relics of the saints, potent bits of bone hidden behind the jewels. Sacred caskets with who knows what, splinters from the true cross, slithers of wood from the table of the Last Supper, or, miraculously preserved, parts of Christ's crib. Medieval society revered them. Rome, the burial place of Peter and Paul, attracted pilgrims from all over Christendom. Here, they could hear the tales of the early sufferings, marvel at the signs left by the early martyrs, bow their knee and praise the carpenter's son as Lord of all. A fortunate few made it to the holy city itself, Jerusalem. Amongst them, the pious and the adventurers. Descendants of the pagan peoples of the distant north. Their great conquest at Hastings is familiar enough. Few know of their other great conquest, far to the south. It's a story that's worth the telling. It profoundly affected the lives of millions and influenced the whole history of Europe. A new millennium and comparative peace in Europe. The long-awaited apocalypse had failed to materialize. There was optimism in the air. This new Europe, although politically disunited, in religion was as one, united under one cross, one church. At the head of that church, one man, the Pope. The popes had been claiming to be the vicars of Christ for centuries, but kings and emperors also had claims to the divine right of rule. The balance had long tipped in favor of the secular powers, and the papacy was left defenseless in the snake pit of Italian politics. The seat of St. Peter was on offer to the highest bidder. This was the age of whores. All was set to change. A new breed of popes would challenge the balance of power in Europe. They would do so with more than a little help from the Normans. Devout Christians since their conversion at the time of Rollo, the Normans were zealous pilgrims. Great throngs of them made the long journey to the Holy Land. Part of the pilgrimage schedule included disembarkation at the heel of Italy and the long trek up here to Monte Gargano, and the shrine of the Archangel Michael. He was the warrior angel, the patron of their great abbey back home in Normandy, an ideal patron for violent men in need of the church's approval. Normans bent the knee to no man. They did so readily here to receive the bread and the wine. Good churchmen all, they were set to play a key role in church affairs. The southern Italy of the new millennium was a melting pot of cultures and civilizations. the crossroad of Greek and Roman civilizations, of the Byzantine East, of the Catholic West, of the European North and the Arab South.
Forse la cosa più importante da dire è che la conquista del sud dell'Italia e della Sicilia è molto differente da altre conquiste, diciamo, normanne. Per esempio la conquista dell'Inghilterra da parte dei Normanni è una conquista che viene fatta da un duca, quindi da uno Stato, da un organismo politico nei confronti di un altro organismo politico. Quello dei Normanni nel sud dell'Italia invece è la storia di cavalieri e avventurieri che si inseriscono nelle lotte politiche interne, appunto parte imperiale, parte papale, ma soprattutto il forte influsso del Papa, bizantini e longobardi del sud dell'Italia, lotte fra i musulmani, fra i capi musulmani nell'isola di Sicilia.
Italy was a patchwork quilt mess, the foot and the heel of the country firmly in the grip of the Eastern Byzantine Church. The Pope held his estates in the centre. The Muslims dominated Sicily with the remainder given to constant squabbling. But there were changes ahead. The Church of Quattro Coronati in Rome gives graphic expressions of a story. An old document had come to light regarding the Emperor Constantine and the papacy. The Pope had miraculously cured him of a potentially fatal illness. The rewards were instant and generous, but to crown everything, Constantine donated to him the whole of Italy. This ancient document was now foisted as the papacy's legal right of inheritance. It was only in the 15th century that the document was exposed as a fake. Some fake. This was the political scenario that saw the entrance of the Normans.
There was a mixture of Lombards and Byzantines and sort of minor local barons. And they were all really sort of struggling together. The whole place was pretty chaotic. Theoretically, it belonged to the Byzantine Empire, but there weren't an awful lot of soldiers and garrisons there to keep the peace. And that was why, in 1015, this young Lombard met this bunch of Normans in this shrine of Monte Sant'Angelo and said, look, if only we had, 50 or 100 young chaps like you and your horses, we could kick these Greeks out forever. And it's all yours. It's all yours. I mean, there's vast quantities of land. You can carve out any little sort of estates you want. And this sounded so wonderful that they all came down and did it.
One of the first Normans to seize the initiative was Rainulf Drengot, quick to realize that if he and his knights made themselves indispensable, they would be handsomely rewarded. The new fiefdom of Aversa was Rainulf's first reward. Today, an insignificant town, but in the 11th century, of crucial strategic importance. For the Normans, it was their first big breakthrough in southern Italy. Word of their success quickly spread back to Normandy. Southern Italy was ripe for the taking. Where Rainulf led, others soon followed. Among them, the sons of a minor knight from this insignificant town in northern Normandy.
Tancred Hauteville was a rather dim knight who had a small property near Cherbourg. But like so many of the Normans at that particular moment, he had an enormous family. They all had huge families, this terrific population explosion. And he had 12 sons, can't remember how many daughters. And of course, there was no property to leave to them. So you had all these footloose younger sons with nothing to do except to go and seek adventure.
And seek it they did. They settled in the town of Melfi, and from the castle they quickly built here, ruled with an iron fist. In essence, they were little better than military thugs. their sword on sale to the highest bidder. But out of their ranks, one proved himself a genius. He would not settle for the minor fiefdom of Melfi. He set his eyes on much greater rewards. His name, still unfamiliar outside of Italy, Robert Guiscard.
He proved to be a leader of the very, very, very first rank, and I think probably the biggest, the greatest, the most successful military adventurer between Julius Caesar and Napoleon. And if he hadn't died of typhoid when he did, just off Cephalonia, when leading an expedition against the Byzantine Empire, he might easily have taken Constantinople, and the whole history of Europe and of Christendom would have been changed.
In a well-thought-out campaign, Robert Guiscard stoked the fires of discontent and rivalry in the region. He emerged a major force to be reckoned with, driven by ambition and, yes, downright greed. In a brutal, unforgiving age, the Normans had struck lucky. As the Norman juggernaut moved north, the whole of the Amalfi coast was in danger. The Archbishop, like many before him, had made his supplication to the Almighty to deliver him and his flock from the wrath of the Normans. The Almighty and his saints were silent. To defend his territory, he would have to resort to arms. His was a motley troop of men, ill-armed, ill-disciplined. Faced with the Normans, there could only be one outcome. There was only one outcome. As news of Guiscard's relentless campaign reached Rome, Pope Leo IX denounced him for mutilating Christ, his church, and the papacy. He acted by assembling a holy alliance.
Il rapporto fra i Normanni e il Papa è molto complicato perché all'inizio sono visti come una minaccia. Nelle fonti ecclesiastiche dell'Italia meridionale si parla di maledetti normanni.
Leo launched a holy war, hoping now at least for the Almighty's help. Had no one told him that he always sided with the Normans? Despite initial misgivings about raising their swords against the Vicar of Christ, the Normans soon launched into the fray. The Pope, safe behind the ramparts, looked on as the mounted Norman knights cut his ramshackle army to pieces. The battlefield of Civitate was strewn with the dead or dying papal forces. By sunset, Pope Leo had neither army or allies left standing. In a curious act of piety, the Normans fell on their knees and implored the Pope's forgiveness. Defeated and humiliated, Leo knew that somehow he would have to accommodate this fierce Norman force. To achieve his political goals in southern Italy, the papacy needed allies, and armed ones at that. And so, with great reluctance, Leo turned to the Normans. As the Pope's right-hand men, the Normans could help him bring the whole of southern Italy back into the papal fold. On his way to make amends with Robert Guiscard, the Pope was asked to consecrate the Norman church here at Venosa. He was learning fast that deals with the Normans always carried a price tag. Still, they had always treated the papacy with respect, and the church consecrated by him became the mausoleum for the earliest members of the Hauteville dynasty.
The papacy in southern Italy would really like to divide and rule. Southern Italy has always been a complex mixture of peoples. There are Greeks, there are Lombards, and then, of course, from the 11th century on, there are Normans. If you think about southern Italy as really being in three main blocks, if you like, there's Sicily and there's Calabria and Apulia, and it's in the Pope's interest to keep those apart and to be able to play off one against the other. And he'd like to be able to do that when the Normans come, but it doesn't work out the way he wants, and the Normans get it all together. And this makes the Pope's position very precarious. And there are occasions when the Pope really tries to break the power of the Normans, but he never manages.
At Melfi, the Pope paid the heaviest price of all when he invested Robert with the duchies of Apulia and Calabria in southern Italy, and the lordship of Sicily, under the solemn sovereignty of St. Peter. The one-time enemy of the Pope had now become its most devout protector. And so he was quickly dispatched to help realize papal hopes of capturing southern Italy from the grip of the Byzantine East. Many territories had developed into hereditary dukedoms, fundamentally Greek in language, in culture, and in religion. In reality, the Pope had gifted the Normans lands which were not his to give. Here, it was the Greek Orthodox version of Christianity that held sway. It was the Patriarch of Constantinople who interpreted the Christian message. The Normans were advancing on his domains, stealing his lands. He responded to each report with bouts of violent anger. Sicily was altogether another matter.
Da quel momento in poi hanno una forte legittimazione, grazie appunto al sostegno del Papa, vengono investiti della contea di Sicilia da conquistare e ricevono anche un privilegio molto particolare, quello di essere rappresentanti legati del Papa in Sicilia, in questa terra musulmana da conquistare, e di poter nominare i vescovi della Sicilia, quindi un controllo non solo sulla parte militare e politica ma anche su quella religiosa.
The island was in complete disarray. Civil war between Arab and Greek had divided the country. Confusion and anarchy sapped its potentially rich economy. It was the natural next step in the Norman conquest of the south.
Ci sono molti motivi per cui i normanni intraprendono questa difficile conquista della Sicilia. Il primo motivo è che è una terra ricca. 2 secoli di dominio musulmano ne hanno fatto una terra ricca, con nuove colture, dallo zucchero allo zafferano al cotone e soprattutto il grano.
Sicily exceeded all Norman hopes, a field of dreams for young Normans eager to make their own way in life. Slowly they turned their backs on their homeland in France. The Piazza Armerina in the heart of Sicily. Every year, proud Sicilians revel in their Norman heritage. They're here to celebrate the coming of the Normans and the reclamation of the island to the Pope. The Normans succeeded because of their superior military strengths. But there was an X factor too. The total conviction that God was on their side. When Roger laid siege to Palermo, Sicily was conquered. But there was no sack of the city, no rape, no plunder. Roger had demonstrated a chilling aptitude to cruelty in the past, but he had now developed the gifts of statesmanship and diplomacy. In a display of un-Norman-like behaviour, he offered the local Arabs the most generous surrender terms.
Roger did a tremendous job because he was the one who realized, I think, that there were very few Normans. The Sicily that they'd found was partly composed of Greeks and partly composed of Arabs. And he realized that the only way to make a go of this was if he got both the Greeks and the Arabs on his side. There was no question of dominating them. There weren't enough Normans to do that. They all had to be pulling together. And he had this extraordinary vision, and in the 12th century, or the 11th century indeed, at the end of the 11th century, it was the most extraordinary vision that you could get these three totally different peoples and religions and languages all to cooperate and make a go of this extraordinary little island.
Muslim and Greek Palermo had escaped the full brunt of the vicious and bloody campaigns engulfing other centres around the Mediterranean. Devout Catholics themselves, both Roger and Robert openly tolerated other faiths, practices and their followers. Not something, incidentally, which would have gained the approval of Pope Leo. He wanted everything in his hands. Christ in Sicily, vowed Roger, would be worshipped the way the people chose. So too would Allah be openly worshipped in the way the Arabs chose. Such religious freedom was unheard of elsewhere in the medieval world. In other parts of southern Italy, things were not so rosy. Robert's work there was nearing its completion in blood. Bari, the last stronghold of the Byzantines, chose to oppose the Norman forces. They lived, or rather died, to regret it. As usual, the Norman forces were ruthless. They took no prisoners. Bari marked the end of Byzantine rule in Italy. This grand cathedral church celebrates the fact. Probably bolstered by this success, Pope Leo sent a delegation to Constantinople to confirm his rights over Italy and to reaffirm his supremacy in matters of faith here. Things got from bad to worse when one of the papal legates excommunicated the Patriarch. He in turn excommunicated the Pope. An open breach was created in the Christian Church. It has not been healed to this day. It is at least fitting that in this cathedral, the papacy's debt to the Normans is acknowledged. They were its military props. Their methods may have been distinctly un-Christian, but they had brought back southern Italy to the papal fold. Since the 7th century, a force had been released from Arabia that challenged Christianity head-on. The revelations of the Prophet Muhammad captured the minds and hearts of the Arab world. One by one, the once great Christian centers abandoned Christ and bowed to the new faith. As the Christian Church was shilly-shallying about the precise nature of Christ, as they dotted each I and crossed each T in the creeds, so Islam spread unchecked. The holy city itself, Jerusalem, fell. To the affront of Jew and Christian alike, the Dome of the Rock was erected. No images of Allah or his prophet Muhammad adorn its walls, but there is splendor enough. So how would the papacy, with their newfound allies, the Normans, face the followers of Muhammad? Power dominated the imagination of the papacy, and it had to be asserted in the East and the West. It captured the spirit of Cardinal, Archdeacon and monk Hildebrand. In 1073, he was elected by popular acclaim Gregory VII. In the Lateran Church are preserved the skulls of Peter and Paul, and Peter inspired Gregory to transform the church. His exalted vision has come down to us in a list of 27 propositions, the Dictatus Papae. The Pope can be judged by no one. The Roman Church has never erred and will never err till the end of time. The Pope alone can depose and restore bishops. He alone can make new laws, set up new bishoprics, and divide old ones. He alone can call general councils and authorize canon law. He can depose emperors. He can absolve subjects from their allegiance. All princes should kiss his feet. Such a vision was bound to lead to conflict with the emperor. It came in 1076. Henry IV challenged the Pope head-on by electing a number of bishops and abbots in Germany and northern Italy. When the Pope objected, he denounced Gregory as a false monk and pronounced him deposed. Gregory's reply was no less uncompromising. I prohibit Henry from ruling in Germany and Italy. I release all Christians from the oaths which they have sworn to him, and I bind him in the bonds of anathema. The Pope's actions provided Henry's enemies with an excuse to rise against him. To save his throne, he came here to the castle at Canossa in central Italy. Gregory kept him waiting in the snow. Eventually, the Pope emerged and made Henry kiss his stirrup in a gesture of humiliation before he accepted reconciliation. A mighty Pope indeed, then. Or was he? Humiliated and angry, Henry plotted his revenge. 6 years later, he laid siege to Rome and deposed Gregory, removing him from St. Peter's to the Castel Sant'Angelo. Locked in a cell, the Pope had few allies remaining. Most members of the Church itself thought Gregory had gone too far and driven the vehicle of reform into the ditch. So he entrusted his life into the hands of the Normans. They were now his only potential liberators. In an act of vengeance against those who betrayed the Pope, the Normans destroyed everything in their way on their triumphant march through Rome. A quarter of the city was consumed by fire. The Romans would never forgive Gregory or the Normans. The deposed Pope lived out the rest of his days in bitter exile in the Norman territory of Salerno. Everyone was glad to see the back of Gregory, and happy to know that he was now virtually under house arrest with Norman guards. Defiant and free from self-doubt to the end, he declared, "I have loved righteousness and hated iniquity. Therefore I die in exile." His remains were not taken for burial at St. Peter's in Rome. They lie here in the Cathedral Church of St. Matthew in Salerno. Guarded in death, just as in life, by Robert Guiscard. In a Rome still heavily controlled by the emperor and his supporters, a new pope was elected to St. Peter's seat. The heat of reform was turned down, but not switched off. Gregory may well have been defeated, but something of his spirit survived. Pope Urban II's beliefs were close to those of Gregory, but his priority was the reclamation of the Holy Land from the infidel. Here, from the city walls of Clermont-Ferrand in France, he preached the First Crusade. He had hoped for a good army. What he got was the biggest army in the history of mankind. Today, tragic history has become colourful heritage. The Crusades, despite their un-Christian militarism and racial undertones, offer chance for pageant and fun. Many have argued that the early Crusaders were nothing other than mercenary adventurers hoping for fame and fortune, or at least the hope of a little rape and pillage. The old wanderlust still coursed in the Norman bloodstream, and so they joined, from southern Italy and from their homeland.
The Normans, not only do they give the crusade this energy, but they also reinforce the idea that you've got to watch these Westerners, and a lot of the suspicion that develops because of the Crusades between East and West needs to be laid at the feet of the Normans.
A huge range of men and motives were to be involved in the crusade. Many crusaders made huge personal and financial sacrifice, and there can be no doubting the spiritual and religious drive inspired by Urban's call to the cross. After a harrowing march on Friday the 15th of July 1099, they lodged a general assault on the city of Jerusalem. The Normans, chillingly determined, followed behind the Crusader cross. In Jerusalem, the crusade reached its awful climax. With the signs in the heavens, the apparitions, the discovery of relics, and the Norman sword, the capture of Jerusalem was assured. Knights proudly bearing their painted Crusader crosses slashed and hacked their way through the city. The soldiers of Christ entered the Church of the Holy Sepulchre knee-deep in blood. Weeping for joy, they saw Christ's tomb, the site of their Saviour's resurrection. And here they gave thanks to him. Pope Urban had promised that for those who fought would be granted freedom from all their sins. To those who fell in battle, the crown of martyrdom. Western chroniclers, anxious to display the piety of the Crusaders and their cause, conjure images of the Holy City totally purged of all infidels. Recently discovered Muslim contemporary sources tell a different story, with far fewer dead recorded. Whatever the truth, a bloody book had been started. Sadly, chapters of it are still being written. As Norman knights were helping to free Jerusalem, so power in the south crossed over the Straits of Messina. It was solely vested now in the remarkably un-Norman-like Norman, Roger II. Although a devout Catholic, he had avoided the First Crusade. Warlike pursuits, even holy wars, held no attraction for him. He preferred to master the arts rather than the sword. He was a southerner, but more, he had leanings towards the Orient and to the Arab world. No longer a backwater of the Norman state, Sicily's unique multicultural elements would make it eventually the jewel in the Norman crown. June in Palermo, and Sicilians flocked to the streets to worship the patron saint of their island, Santa Rosalia. But these annual festivities are more than a celebration of their Catholic faith. Rosalia was a relative of Roger II, so this is also a celebration of his exceptional reign over Sicilians. Here, Roger developed schemes and projects that went beyond conquest. He became the builder of magnificent monuments of Norman rule. At his seat of power in Palermo, he built this glorious cathedral, which fused all the elements of his diverse state: Arab, Greek, and Latin Catholicism. It was here on Christmas Day in the year 1130 that Roger II was crowned King of Sicily. Outside, the cheering populace waited to hail their king. Roger believed he had been crowned by Christ himself. The banner of the Hautevils had never flown higher.
From that moment on, they didn't need to fight, and they didn't fight. King Roger II was not a fighter. He never led like his uncle and his brothers had done, or his uncles and his father. He never led his armies into war himself or anything like that. He was a sort of peaceful sort of chap, highly cultivated, and when foreign affairs got a bit tricky, he always preferred to solve them by diplomacy rather than by fighting. Diplomacy, of course, also included a certain amount of blatant bribery, because he was very rich. He could afford to buy people off, and did.
While he could afford to buy people off, he much preferred spending his money on building great shrines to Norman rule. King at last, Roger found it both agreeable and prudent to live like one. At the royal palace in Palermo, little remains of the original Saracen fabric of the building. On the first floor, Roger personally supervised the construction of the Palatine Chapel. With gilded Corinthian capitals, heavily ornamented pavements, and magnificent mosaics, the chapel glows gold. Nowhere in southern Italy is the achievement of the Norman kingdom given more stunning visual expression. Latin, Byzantine, and Islamic traditions fused into one harmonious masterpiece.
Well, Roger II was, you wouldn't have thought he was a Norman to look at him. He had an Italian mother. He was very dark and swarthy in appearance. He wasn't one of these sort of blonde Vikings at all. But he'd been brought up in Sicily, so he spoke beautiful Latin, French, Greek, and Arabic. He spoke all the languages of his country, all of which were official, accepted languages of the court. And he built up Sicily. Obviously, it was an incredibly well-placed island for trade. It was bang in the middle of the Mediterranean, halfway between north and south, east and west, and the bazaars of Palermo were absolutely bursting full. And it was doing very well, so it became extremely rich. And with the money that he made, he produced this extraordinary court, first of all. He brought wise men, scholars from every corner of Christendom. If you were, let's say, an English scholar, there was one called Abelard of Bath at that time, and you wanted to learn Greek, you could go to Constantinople, or you could go to Palermo. If you wanted to learn Arabic, you could go to Cordova, or you could go to Palermo. If you wanted to learn both of them, you went to Palermo. So it became this tremendous cultural clearinghouse as well as a commercial one.
While the rest of the continent was locked in battle with the infidel, Roger embraced all the religions of his domains. Once, during an earthquake, Roger saw his concubines and pages pray to Allah for salvation. He announced, "Let each of you pray to the God he adores. He who has faith in his God will have peace in his heart." But it went much further than religious tolerance.
C'è un altro aspetto della coesistenza, della convivenza fra musulmani e cristiani, ed è quello della corte regia. La corte regia è un luogo dove non soltanto i politici, i funzionari, ma anche gli intellettuali sono spesso musulmani e sono al massimo livello. Ricordiamo Al-Idrisi, che è un geografo che lavora per Re Ruggero, scrive una descrizione del mondo in cui gran parte è dedicata alla descrizione del regno di Ruggero, ed è un'opera che viene pure accompagnata da un grande mappamondo, da una rappresentazione d'oro, peraltro molto solenne, dell'orbe terraqueo. Ma Idrisi è soltanto uno degli intellettuali, degli uomini di cultura musulmani in età normale.
Of all the palace scholars, Al-Idrisi was the one whom Roger admired the most. His work culminated in one of the most comprehensive of medieval maps. Beautifully illustrated, it is impressively accurate. At the crossroads of 3 continents, Sicily was the perfect place for Al-Idrisi to carry out his work. At Palermo's bustling ports, clerks of the court picked the brains of anyone passing through. They noted down everywhere they had been and everything they had seen. Roger's eclectic administration included men of arts and science, of politics and philosophy. It took more than architects to give brilliance to Roger's court.
So you've got the 3 great races of the Mediterranean, all coming together, all sparking each other off, all cooperating, producing this incredible thing at a time when everywhere else in the Mediterranean they're all at each other's throats. I mean, the Crusades are going on, there's a great schism between the Eastern and the Western churches, the Western Church and the Orthodox. Everything is going wrong everywhere else, except in this one little island in the middle of it all. It's all coming together and producing this incredible thing. It only lasts a very short time, 64 years, but those 64 years were incredible.
Roger's tolerance and the racial harmony in Sicily set an example of what is possible. Sadly, on the 26th of February 1154, Roger died. It was a peaceful passing, and his body brought for burial here in the cathedral he had built in Palermo. On his sword ring were engraved the words, "The Apulian, Sicilian and African all obey my will." From his father, Roger II had inherited a county. To his son, he bequeathed a kingdom. That son, and his son in turn, were both christened William, and they happily perpetuated Roger's vision. The Cathedral of Monreale, built by William II, bears many of his grandfather's trademarks. Greek and Arabic designs abound. It was indeed a proud offering to the Virgin. The intricately worked Arab wooden roof of the basilica is then followed by golden Byzantine mosaics, all so reminiscent of the royal palace at Palermo. And yet, strangely, as William accepted his rich inheritance, so the great vitality of the Hauteville dynasty seemed to run out of steam. No direct blame can be laid at William's door. The internal fabric of the state just began to decay. It, like William, was breathing its last. William II's greatest sin was his infertility. He did also make one political mistake in consenting to the marriage of his aunt Constance to a certain Henry Hohenstaufen. When William died, childless, so all the ideals of Roger II's kingdom in the sun died with him. Politically, the kingdom survived. It was its ideals that now lay cold. So who now would inherit the crown? Constance's husband Henry had always coveted the Sicilian kingdom. Now he would claim it as his own. He had that same year inherited a still greater crown, that of Holy Roman Emperor. And so, on Christmas Day in 1194 in Palermo Cathedral, Henry was crowned King of Sicily. The people knew that now Sicily had been swallowed up by the vast German Empire. Strangely missing from the coronation that day was the heiress, Constance. But there was a good reason for this. She was in labor. She emerged a few days later with her son, Frederick. He would grow to be a great emperor, but a great German emperor, not Sicilian. In the family crypt at Palermo Cathedral, 4 tombs lie uneasily together. Roger II, the architect of this Norman kingdom. Constance, his daughter, seen unfairly but understandably as the betrayer of her homeland. Her husband Henry, who brought Sicily under German rule. And finally his son, Frederick, the great Roman emperor, whose story belongs elsewhere. The Norman story in Sicily was done. The Normans, as history had known them, had simply disappeared.